Hi, I'm Devon, Minister to Students. Thank you so much for joining us here today at West B. Treat Street is coming. It's a trunk or treat with a twist. Mark your calendars for October the 31st from 6 to 8 p.m. I bet you're asking, Devon, how can I help? I'm glad you asked. You can help by hosting the trunk. Just send an email to brandy@westbradenton.org and she'll get you squared away. Oh, and don't forget, maybe you've seen the candy buckets around campus. Make sure to drop off that candy. For more information on how Treat Street will look, check out kids.westb.org. We want to say a big West B welcome to all of our visitors. We want to know that you're here. Now you know what I'm going to talk about. There's no school like the old school. And the old school is QR codes. But QR codes have gotten a facelift. You can have cool designs and colors. Don't you like it? Don't you want to open the camera on your smartphone and aim it up here, right this very second? I know I do. I love QR codes. Hey lovebirds, we're having a lasting love date night. Yeah, you heard me right. A date night on October the 25th at 5 p.m. right here in the Worship Center. There will be comedians, musical artists, and lots of fun. Tickets start at just $35. You won't want to miss it. Thank you again for your generous giving. Don't forget, you can give online at give.westb.org or on campus in the giving boxes in the Commons area. You are now up to date. Thanks again for joining us. And now, let us worship.
Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin.
It wasn't for nothing that you shed your blood. So I'm gonna live like my shame is gone. Won't be shackled to the way I was. I'm gonna live like my shames are gone, gone.
Now my sin is dead and gone, and I sing hallelujah. Done. He is risen, it is done, and I sing hallelujah. Grace is a weapon that will overcome, and I'm gonna shout like the battle's won. Fall back, devil, 'cause your time is up. I'm gonna live like the stone is gone, gone. Now my sin is dead and gone, and I sing hallelujah. Done, done. He is risen, it is done, and I sing hallelujah.
How great the power of the blood. Oh, oh, I am the righteousness of God. Oh, oh, how great the power of the blood.
Dead and gone, and I sing hallelujah. Done, done. He is risen, it is done, and I sing hallelujah. Gone, gone. No, my sin is dead and gone, and I sing hallelujah.
It's natural to value certain character traits in others. You may even place a higher value on some traits over others. Two character traits that I value more than any other are honesty and loyalty. If you're honest, then I know you value truth. And if you are loyal, then I know you value faithfulness. Seeking the truth and being faithful are extremely important to me. I mean, you can be cranky, you can be undiplomatic, you can be blunt. I can deal with a lot of things if you are honest and loyal. God blesses friendships that are tied together with honesty and loyalty. We're going to be looking at a story today in the book of Ruth, and it's going to reveal the priority of an honest and a loyal friendship. And we're actually beginning a new series today. We're going to go verse by verse to the book of Ruth. And the story begins with chaos and crisis. Here in the book of Ruth, the culture is at the point of moral collapse. The people are just in a point of chaos. And Ruth is at a point of crisis, personally. You know, her sister-in-law, her mother-in-law, they all three lose their husbands. And the story begins with tragedy. Now hang with us as we walk through this 4-week series. It's going to end really well. But the opening scenes begin with tragedy. So let's look at this. Ruth Chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So we begin here with a crisis, a family that has experienced a terrible tragedy. 3 women have lost their husbands. And to understand the gravity of the book of Ruth, you kind of have to understand the context here. Ruth, she is living during a time of moral chaos. In fact, if you look at Judges 21:25, the very last verse of the book of Judges, which is the book right before Ruth, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him." This is an era of history of moral relativism, and it has become pervasive. In the same way, it's kind of pervasive in our culture. Now, what is moral relativism? Moral relativism is simply behavior based on human opinions. Well, a person who believes in moral relativism would say morality is based upon your perspective. And you often hear it said like this, well, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. Here's the problem with this. You are rarely right about what's good for you. I think about kids, and as they're growing up, if left to their own devices, they wouldn't want to do their homework. Adults, if they could just choose whatever's right, a lot of people would manipulate their taxes. So often, without attaching ourselves to absolutes, well, we would do things that we're not supposed to do. But here's a bigger problem. We are a highly individualistic society. And individualism is saying that the needs of the individual are more important than society at large. And when you take individualism and you add to it moral relativism, two things that we see in our culture, that we are morally relative people and that we're a highly individualistic society. When you take those two things together, what happens is that you elevate personal preferences above the true needs of others. So your personal preferences become greater than the concern for society at large. Now, as believers in Jesus, and as we'll see in the book of Ruth, followers of God, that we're called to be countercultural. Everyone was doing what they wanted in Ruth's context. But as we'll see, Naomi sacrificed. Everyone was doing what was right in their eyes. But Ruth, she sacrificed as well. The context of Ruth, in many ways, is our own context. We shouldn't do what's right in our own eyes. We should do what's right in the eyes of God. Now, in the book of Joshua, let's go all the way back to Joshua. So you've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 3 books in a row. So if you go back to the book of Joshua, the time under Joshua, the people of Israel, they had victory after victory, and the people were following God. In fact, Joshua 24:15, great verse. It says, choose for yourselves today, which will you worship, the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you were living? As for me and my family, we will worship the Lord. You know, in a crumbling world of relativism, it's God's absolutes that will stand. The time of great national victory under Joshua, unfortunately, was short-lived. Israel degraded with the rest of society, and they lost their moral compass. There was no king during this time. There was no central governing authority. And for 200 or 300 years following the book of Joshua, they barely held it together with these regional rulers. It was called the time of the Judges. So you go from Joshua to the book of Judges and then to the book of Ruth. And you see at the beginning of the book of Ruth, this was during the time of the Judges. You see that in verse 1. So Ruth is living during a spiritually dark time during the time of the Judges. But Ruth herself is the bright spot. See, the book of Judges, right before Ruth, it focuses on broad stories about the leadership and the power structure of the entire nation. Ruth is a specific story about common people. And the main characters in Ruth, they're not kings or judges or prophets. They're just ordinary commoners. Ruth is ordinary. She has no power, no wealth. She's a single woman scraping by in a time of famine. So let's walk through this story. Elimelech and his wife leave Bethlehem because of a famine. They go to Moab. Naomi, Elimelech's wife, has 2 sons, and they marry women in Moab. Then all of the men die. The 10 years that they were in Moab were hard. The situation is bleak for Naomi. So Naomi is a widow, and her 2 daughters-in-law, they're both widows. Let's see what happens next, picking up in verse 6. She and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She kissed them, and they wept loudly. They said to her, we insist on returning with you and your people. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters, go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourself from remarrying? No. My daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Again, they wept loudly. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not to follow you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you from me." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. The two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This story is remarkable. I mean, even the title of the book is something to note. Ruth is not an Israelite, but a Moabitess woman. This is the only Old Testament book named after a non-Israelite. Additionally, Ruth isn't the main character. She's not the predominant character. She's among the main characters, but this is a story really more about Naomi and Boaz. But Ruth kind of comes to light as a supporting character, and there's a reason for this. It's because of the theme, as we'll see throughout the rest of this series, and as we'll see throughout the rest of the book. The theme of the book is that God alone can move you from emptiness to fulfillment. Naomi, as we saw at the end of the text that I just read, she thinks she's empty. But what God is really doing, as we'll see later on, he's beginning to fill her. The story begins with tragedy, but it will end with delight. And there's a glimmer of hope. We see that at the beginning of this. I mean, if you look at verse 6, the famine in Judah is ending. In verse 7, they travel about 60 miles back to Judah. And then Naomi kind of drops this major thing on them. She says, "Go back home to your families and leave me." I mean, it's a gut-wrenching scene. I mean, they weep in verse 9. They weep together. Naomi, in some ways, is being selfless. She's placing the needs of her daughter-in-law above her own. And this is a New Testament principle. Naomi wouldn't have known it at the time, but we see this theme in the Bible. We see it in John chapter 15, 12 through 13, where we learn, this is my command. This is Jesus' command. Love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. Naomi is willing to suffer so that the daughters-in-law can be free. Naomi's sacrifice foreshadows the sacrifice of Jesus. I mean, in the ancient Near East culture, the security for women only came through marriage. If they were not married, particularly if they were widowed or older, they were going to live a life of poverty and a life of insecurity. And so she's preparing for this life of abject poverty. She's preparing for this life of loneliness. And Naomi knew that if Ruth and Orpah returned with her to Judah, they would have little chance at new life because they were Moabites, not Israelites. So Naomi's also too old to remarry. There are no more men in the family to take care of Ruth or Orpah. It would, and as you saw here in the text, it would be absurd to think that Naomi could have more sons for them to marry. And so this is a very painful decision. I mean, both Ruth and Orpah, they love Naomi. This is a loving relationship built on honesty and loyalty. And then we get this phrase here where Naomi in verse 8 speaks to Ruth and Orpah, and she says, "May the Lord show kindness to you." Now, there's something obscure but quite remarkable here. Naomi assumes that God's authority and love extends beyond the Hebrew people. So, again, Ruth and Orpah are from Moab. They're not Hebrew people. They're women who are Moabitess women. So Naomi assumes that God's going to show his love, God's going to show his kindness. And the word for kindness here is hesed. And it's actually kind of a rough translation because there's no real English word for it. It refers to all the attributes of God, the love of God, the mercy of God, the grace of God, the faithfulness of God. And throughout the Bible, this major theme starts to emerge that God is available to all, not just some. God can move anyone from a place of emptiness to one of fullness. Now, why would the Hebrew people elevate a widowed woman from Moab? Why would we see this book the way that it is? It's because everyone is important to God. God's grace extends beyond geographic and ethnic borders. Ruth is a different ethnicity. She is also from a different place. So God does not just redeem the extraordinary. God is the redeemer of the ordinary. God is the redeemer of everyone, every place. God is the redeemer of every tongue, every tribe, every nation. So here in the story, Orpah returns to her home, and she's not to blame for that. That's what she felt like she needed to do. But Ruth, here it says, clings to Naomi. And then we get this beautiful reply of Ruth in verse 16 and 17. And in this reply, we see the loyalty and the honesty, the true friendship where Ruth says, I will not abandon you. And Ruth goes so far as to say, I will die for you. And Ruth does something here. When she talks about God, she says, and your God will be my God. But she also says, may the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates me from you. The term that Ruth uses there, Lord, that's Yahweh, the personal name of God. She doesn't say Elohim, which could be a reference to just a higher power. She knows who God is. Ruth is acknowledging the God of the Hebrews as the one true God. And she knows, even just but a glimpse here into what will become a New Testament principle, that God's mission is that every people group have the opportunity to hear about salvation. In fact, we learn in the New Testament, Matthew 24:14, this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Matthew 28 also uses that phrase, all nations. And in the Greek, panta ta ethne, all the nations. This is more than just geopolitical boundaries. This is more than just nation states. This is deeper than ethno-linguistic people groups. And notice what it says there. It doesn't say that the gospel should be preached in Matthew. It doesn't say that the gospel might be preached. It says that the gospel will be preached. Matthew 24:14 is a promise. The gospel will get to all these people. It will go to every tongue, every tribe, and every nation. And if you care about the end of the story, and then the end will come, it says, if you care about the end of the story, then you will work to complete the story. You are God's promise to the nations. Naomi, back to the book of Ruth. Naomi is devastated as she returns with Ruth to Bethlehem. Now again, this story's gonna get better. It begins with tragedy and it starts moving up from here. So hang with us for these next 3 weeks as we see the story improve. But so Naomi's it's hard for her when she gets back into Bethlehem. All the people surround her. Is that you, Naomi? Now Naomi, her name means sweet. And how does she reply when they're like, is that you? Is that really you, Naomi? What does she say? She says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me sweet. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. Don't call me sweet. Call me bitter. She thinks that, at least at this point, that God is opposed to her, and he's not. In fact, he has a really good plan for her. Naomi's place of bitterness is actually the way in which salvation opens to the world. I mean, let's think about this. Now, Naomi returns in bitterness, but where does she return to? Where was Jesus born? Where's her hometown? Bethlehem. Don't miss this connection. Naomi and Ruth go back where? Bethlehem. They go back, at least Naomi does, with bitterness. Who would experience bitterness for the sake of salvation? Jesus. And And who would end up being in the lineage of Jesus? As we learn in Matthew's genealogy, it's Ruth. See, the birth of Jesus does not happen without Naomi traveling a difficult road back to Bethlehem. You see, God's using this. He's using her bitterness for his plan. Ruth returning with Naomi puts her at a lot of risk. I mean, Ruth herself's at a lot of risk. At this time in Israel, there's a lot of racial tension. Ruth, being a woman from Moab, could experience violence. But what does she say? She says, your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Ruth was willing to give her life so that Naomi could have one. Ruth left her father's house and became an outsider, risking everything in an act of sacrificial love. Think about this. She left her father's house, became an outsider, risked everything in an act of sacrificial love. Does that remind you of someone? Jesus' name is not mentioned in Ruth, but he's right here in the middle of the story. And this story only gets better from here.
As Pastor Sam shared with us, Ruth and Naomi lived in a time where everyone did what was right in their own eyes and did what was best for them. But Ruth and Naomi were different, very much like the characters you're about to see in this clip.
Use the Force, Luke.
The Force is strong in this one. I have you now. What? Yahoo!
Look out! You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home. Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.
For those of you who haven't seen Star Wars, first of all, you need to see Star Wars if you want to go to heaven. I mean, after all, there's a whole book of the Bible named after the main character.
What?
I'm totally joking. I'm kidding. But if you haven't seen Star Wars, Han Solo is a man who does what is right in his own eyes, doing what he thinks is best for him, much like the people that Ruth and Naomi were surrounded with. But when Han realized that his friend Luke Skywalker was in trouble, he came to his rescue. He sacrificed his needs and desires to make sure his friend would be safe. What do you think about that? Would that be a hard decision to make? The message we often get from the world is, look out for yourself. You be you. Look out for number one, yourself. This is not God's message. God's message is found in 1 Corinthians 10:24. Don't be concerned for your own good, but for the good of others. That is what Ruth did. That is what Naomi did. So let's be concerned for others' good by being truthful, loyal, and by putting their needs in front of our own. May the Force be with you, always.